Chapter 12, The Color Line. How'd you like that hugs and slugs video from last lesson? I tell you, I got a little bit dizzy just watching him bend down so much, but he made a lot of sense. I told you at the end of last lesson I was going to explain the beginnings of the KKK this time. Well, I was reading a book called The Tennessee by Dr. Donald Davidson, and he's a very eminent historian. He was of a group called the Fugitives, writing back in the 20s down in Tennessee. They were extremely liberal, and they were against everything, including the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. They were against anything FDR wanted to do. But in his book, he describes the history of Tennessee, and in Chapter 8, he describes how the KKK got started and why. Now, his opinion is that it was a bad governor in Tennessee, combined with the radical Republicans and the Union League. Well, however, whether that's true or not, we do know that there's never going to be a truly authentic history of the KKK written, because its members were pledged to secrecy, and even those who did make revelations did so very hesitantly and not completely, and all the documents were destroyed. But we do know that it began in a little town called Plessy in Giles County in southwestern Tennessee in 1865. We also know it was 60 young Confederates that began, and if you check some sources, it even gives you the names of the 6 young Confederates. The first time they got together, they met in the office of a law judge. Well, of course, he's a law judge, law office of a judge. Later, they met in someone's home, and then even later, they went to the ruined plantation home of Dr. B. Carter on a hill just outside of town. What they wanted was a place that was, well, private, where they could form a social club. That's all they wanted to do, was have a social club and have some innocent fun. They chose the name Klu Klux Klan because it happens to be Greek for a circle of friends or clan, and they were all college-educated young men, and they had Greek background, Greek classical background. They wanted to have a secret society, with ceremonies and passwords, and they were going to wear disguises. They were going to cover themselves with sheets. They were going to use headgear with pointed things on the end of it. Just stupid stuff. And their leader was going to be called a Grand Kiops, and of course, anyone who wasn't official would be called a ghoul. And to further the atmosphere, if you would, they dressed up a dummy, like an old Roman officer, put an axe in his hand, and put him at the entrance of the plantation. A lot of fun, much laughter. Well, this plantation's on a hill outside of town. It's a time when we didn't have electricity. You had to burn fires to have any light. Now, I'm sure most of you have either played the word game of shadows, not the word game, but the game of shadows on the wall with your children, or had it played with you, where you take your hands and make them look like ducks and things on the wall. Well, when these gentlemen were up there with their sheets and their headgear, and they're dancing in the firelight, they cast shadows, and they would just scare the heck out of anybody that saw it, especially the newly freed blacks, who were easily frightened. They were so frightened that whenever there would be a meeting up there at night, they wouldn't go out at night. They wouldn't even go to their own union meetings. They stayed at home. And the citizens, or should we say town leaders, the older, wiser group, of course, noticed that, when these young boys are having their meetings up there, the blacks are staying off the streets. Why don't we do something to enlarge this group and maybe tighten up the organization a little bit and get some good leadership? And the purpose of this would be to frighten and keep under control the newly freed black men and women. In April of 1866, the town leader sent out summons to other clubs in around the state and locally. Come on to Nashville, because the word of this club and having fun and playing pranks had spread all over the South. And they're the club that were going to define it and organize it. Now, most people credit Nathan Bedford Forrest with being the guiding setup, but there's no proof to it, and Mr. Forrest did not put anything in writing himself claiming to it. Unfortunately, the encyclopedia does credit him with forming the thing from beginning to end. Now, he firmly believed that if you had to use force, if it was necessary, okay, but he really didn't like force. He preferred intimidation. And what they wanted to do is play pranks on the blacks. And you see, one of the things that they did, and we can credit this with Forrest because it sounds just like something he'd do, they would have parades. And they'd even announce ahead of time they were going to have a parade. And they all dressed up in the same uniform, because that's one of the things that they changed when they got it organized. They had a consistent uniform, not just the crazy sheets. They actually had gray uniforms with masks and hoods. And only when rare occasions they wear the sheets. they'd ride into town as a group, 50s, hundreds, 150 of them, and they would ride in quietly, and no commands would be given, and they'd stop right in the middle of town. And it'd be so quiet you couldn't hear anything except maybe the horse's tail flicking against his skin, or the equipment on the horse. And all of a sudden, with no command at all, they'd do a 90-degree turn, and they'd sit there for a few more minutes, and nothing would be said. And then a few minutes later, they'd turn another 90-degree turn and sit there a few minutes, and then gallop out of town. And you're saying, what the hey? What's going on? You don't know. The prospect of what they could have done is scaring you to death. And sometimes when they go into these towns, as soon as they leave, the citizens will start shooting at each other. It just craziness. And sometimes they would, in the beginning, they would put on a sheet and they had it, and they'd ride up to a black man in the field and say, I haven't had any water since Shiloh, and throw a pumpkin down and laugh like crazy and ride off. Now, they hadn't touched anyone. They hadn't hurt anybody. In the beginning, nobody was hurt. It was stupid pranks. Now, according to Dr. Donaldson, this club began as a social club for pleasure, and it was a response to the fact that they had a governor who was what I call wishy-washy. He was on the fence. He was anti-slavery. He was pro-slavery. He was anti-disenfranchisement. He was pro-enfranchisement. Every time he turned around, he changed his mind on something depending on who was in command. He was very, very hard on the ex-Confederates. These young men, they couldn't vote. They couldn't work. They were disenfranchised totally all the way down the line. They had nothing else to do but sit around and do nothing. But the idea of these groups are spreading throughout the Deep South. And unfortunately, not the original KKK. It did start being used more than just to intimidate. They got a little rough. They started using some whipping. And before you know it, with the new leadership, they decided that, if you didn't agree with me, whether you're white or black, you could be punished. If you were a Republican in the South where you shouldn't be, you could be run out of town or hurt. Anything, maybe I didn't like the way you looked at my wife. Any reason at all, we can put on our hoods and go out and cause some trouble. But there got to be so much terror and so much bloodshed that Nathan Bedford Forrest sent out orders to all the Klan, the original Klan. We're going to disband. All disguises, all paraphernalia, all documents were burned, destroyed. And the original KKK history, of course, is gone. There are other organizations like the White Camellia, Knights of Columbus, not Knights of Columbus, but Knights of, what is it, Knights of something, Knights of Camellia, and even some who call themselves the KKK. But the KKK, the original KKK, was only in business for about 4 years, and it was disbanded totally in 1869. Now, I guess it'd be a couple of months later, like we said last lesson, when the Congress had an investigation and had thousands and thousands of pages of testimony. Former General Forrest was invited to come and testify, and he never admitted anything. He either didn't know, he couldn't remember. Do I think he was involved? Yes, because too much of the things that they were done sound like some of the tricks he pulled on the Yankee soldiers when he was in command. Do I think that he believed in killing unnecessarily? No, that goes back to what I said about Fort Pillow. If force was necessary, he didn't mind. Killing was what you did in the war, but he didn't do it indiscriminately. So the original KKK is gone. And these other organizations are, well, they're starting to get into it now. The KKK was revived, I guess you'd say, in 1915. We'll get to World War I. But no, we won't, not in this class. Oh, I'm sorry. That's the other class. We get to World War. Anyway, it's revived during World War I, and it's surprising. It's not Southerners. It's not rednecks. It's Midwesterners. And the largest population was actually in Indiana. That's another class. Okay, now back to the lesson at hand. The Redeemer governors had gained control in the South. And as we've already discussed, any rights that the blacks had depended upon the military being there. And when they were removed in 1776 as a result of that bargain with President Hayes, or excuse me, soon to be President Hayes, all rights began to evaporate very quickly. Well, it seemed like every time we turn around, the South is not doing what they're supposed to, and the Northern citizens are just getting tired of it. They want to get back to the business of business and making money and moving west, and the South obviously is not going to change. But We do have some new rules in the Constitution. But one thing you need to remember is the 15th Amendment does not give the right to vote. It doesn't say you can vote. It just says the states cannot deny you the right to vote because of your color. But enforcement is kind of left up to each state. Kind of settle your own problem kind of thing. And it reminds me of like when your parents are so aggravated at you for doing what you're doing, like fighting with a sibling over some item. They throw up their hands and say, "Oh, settle it yourselves. I've had enough of this fighting." Yeah, I must admit I did that with my children when they were small. I'm not proud of the fact, but sometimes you just reach the end of your rope and you don't know how to solve the problem, so you just flat give up. Disenfranchisement. Now, the states didn't want problems with that 15th Amendment. They didn't want, the federal government sending in troops, so they used semi-legal means. And I say semi-legal because that's my own terminology, because to me, they were not legitimate laws. They were not legal. But unfortunately, they were enforceable laws passed in the South. One of the ways to keep the black men from voting is make qualifications aimed to eliminate specific groups. Or to move the polling places without notice, or better yet, say you're going to move them and then don't. Of course, you can stuff the ballot boxes because you've got pre-printed ballots. You can even bring people in from other states to vote, or you could just plain buy your vote. And then, of course, you have to be able to read and interpret the state's constitution to the satisfaction of local authorities. Excuse me. And I'm ashamed to admit that I had to do that when I registered to vote. I registered to vote in Georgia, and I didn't have to read the Constitution. I did have to demonstrate that I was supposedly intelligent enough to read, and I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. We don't want people voting you can't read and write. And they handed me a card, and when they handed me the card, they say, read the Lord's Prayer. Well, even if you're not a Christian or you're a Catholic, most people have some idea of the version of some semblance of the Lord's Prayer, so even if I didn't know it, I could have recited it. I did not know that had I been black, I would have had to read and interpret the state's constitution. So I do apologize to any of my African American students for that. In my innocence, I didn't know. It's amazing the things we didn't know back in the 50s and 60s. One of the things they do, and they still do it in Kentucky, is they have those big barbecues, which I guess you'd say is a form of vote buying. But somehow or another, as much as I love food, I don't think buying me some food is going to change my vote. But once the blacks are under control, according to the white South, the seemingly solidarity of the white Democratic Party starts to, shall we say, wane. The old divisions of class start to reappear. You've got the city versus the farm. You got the farmer versus the business. You've got the city versus the farm. It's just kind of nutty. And so for a new political party is going to be formed called the Readjuster Party. Now, in all honesty, when I started taking history courses when I went back to college, I'd never heard of the Readjuster Party. Blacks and whites cooperating and getting along, it just didn't make any sense. And granted, it wasn't around very long, but, well, they even changed their name from the Readjuster to the Liberal Party. And they had success for years. For 4 years, they got a governor elected. They got some congressmen elected. But then, guess what? Racist politics began to emerge in this party. It could have been a very influential party. It should have been a very influential party, but race is going to always tell the story. Meanwhile, even though these were in the South, the West is restless and, shall we say, unhappy. And began a movement called the agrarian movement or the Grange movement back in 1870s. And they weren't going to get involved in politics. They just would go to not big parties, but I know I lived in Kansas for a number of years, and they used to have all those fairs and carnivals and rodeos and things around, and it would just be a gathering place for you to get together and talk. Because they had some serious concerns. They were concerned about low crop prices, which is nothing new. That's been going on for hundreds of years. High mortgage rates. Well, yes, the raising railroad rates. And like I said, at first it was just talk. We're complaining about no politics. They were also concerned over this currency issue that was floating around, and whether to have gold or silver as our backing our money up. And we had switched from the silver to the gold, and that caused a lot of problems because they weren't buying silver anymore. Well, the farmers were upset with the Eastern bankers because it's always the Eastern bankers' fault no matter what goes wrong. They're upset with the Eastern businessmen, so they began to form a loosely knit group called the Farmers Alliance. They're both in the West and the South, and some of them were integrated, and some of them were all black. In 1891, they got together and they met in Cincinnati, and they decided it's time to go political. They formed a new political party called the Populist Party or the People's Party. Let me read you part of their platform, where they wanted a secret or Australian ballot, which was voting is going to be conducted publicly in many areas, but to assure that no one else knows what you vote, you're going to have secret. Nobody's going to see what you vote for. They wanted a popular election of U.S. senators because at this point in time, as provided in the original Constitution, senators were selected by the state legislatures, not by popular vote. They wanted direct democracy. They wanted referendums. They wanted to recall means to give the people a more voice in their vote. They wanted banking reforms. They believed that a lot of their problems were caused by bankers being unfair. And they wanted to end the national banking system from a point of view that wasn't widely held. And also, they proposed the Federal Reserve System, which was never established. They wanted government ownership of railroads. They felt that the railroads were charging outlandish prices, and the irony is at this point in time, the railroad rates were the lowest they'd ever been. They wanted graduated income tax. They thought this was a way to pry loose some of that money from the big rich people. And a graduated tax meant that the rate of taxation would increase as one's income increased. Of course, that didn't happen right away. And then when it did happen, it was declared unconstitutional. They wanted free and unlimited quantities of silver, which simply means that they wanted the government to buy all silver that was mined, whereas at this point in time it was not. Now, this, of course, is not all, but it's also close to the demands of the progressive movement that's going to happen here very shortly. Now, the preamble to the Declaration of Principles I thought was just really something else. The conditions which surround us best justify our cooperation. We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominated the ballot box, the legislature, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench. Sounds to me like they were mad as hell and weren't going to take it anymore. Just a little bit more and we'll get on with it. They also demanded a national currency that was safe and sound. That's good. They wanted government ownership of the telegraph and telephone like they had the post office. They wanted to disband the standing army. They wanted pensions to ex-Union soldiers and sailors, and to limit the presidential term to one term only. Also, one of the things they wanted to do was to not have the government subsidize any private corporation for any reason at all. Now, I don't sound too extreme except disbanding the military. It sounds a lot like some other, some proposals made by other parties. This new party, Populist or People's, it actually began to revive and stimulate some of the blacks to get back into vote again and got some more blacks elected to office. But being unable to control the blacks, the white Democrats began to cry of black government and black corruption in government. You can't win for losing. In the Deep South, the blacks are mostly voting Republican. And the Populist Party did little to reach out to the blacks, and when they did, the white Democrats began to use force to force them to change their minds. Presidential election, 1896. The new Populist Party, they didn't rant, they ran. A man named William Jennings Bryan. My apologies. They seem to know when I'm on the computer, and that's when they want to do the grass cutting or maintenance work around here. William Jennings Bryan, you'll hear about him later on, especially if you take American history. Maybe you'll go away a minute. I don't have that big a yard for him to cut, so he can't make too many passes. Okay, we'll try it again. If it's not one thing, it's something else. William Jennings Bryan. Now, I know there are recordings of his voice on file. I've never heard him, but the general consensus is he had a voice that could charm a bird out of a tree. He was the idol of the Midwest. He was the good man. Unfortunately, he lost to Republican William McKinley, a former governor of Ohio. And, of course, rising farm prices at last, because we'd had this depression here between 92 and 94. It's about over with. The fact that they lost the election. And, though people who lived in the city couldn't care two who spent what went on at the farms. Not farmers' problems, they're not concerned. It kind of undermined the agrarian movement. And before you know it, it died. Well, the South goes on a campaign of complete disenfranchisement of blacks. Now, they're going to put some meat on those black codes. They're going to enforce the black codes. And Katie barred the door. Courts begin ruling against the black lawsuits. Not looking good for the black man. But the people of the South didn't want the federal troops to come in. Like I said, they didn't want any trouble over the 15th Amendment. So they had to move with caution. But move, they did move. The voting requirements were tightened up and enforced. Okay, so with all these requirements, you might lose a few hundred white votes, but what's that compared to the thousands of possible black votes? High poll taxes, very lengthy requirements for residencies. And if you've been convicted of bribery or burglary or theft, arson, perjury, murder, bigamy, or even a lottery ticket, you couldn't vote. And it's called the Mississippi Plan. Of course, they had a grandfather clause, and they were trying to get some of the poor whites that were illiterate back in. If your parents had voted in 1867 elections, you could vote even if you couldn't read. Well, folks, in 1867, no blacks were registered to vote. And it did bring in some poor white voters. Plessy v. Ferguson. Now, Homer Plessy was a 30-year-old shoemaker in New Orleans. He was jailed for sitting in the all-white car of the East Louisiana Railroad. He was only 1/8 black and 7/8 white, so by any other standards he'd be considered white. But because of the Mississippi law, a drop of blood, he was considered black. The Separate Car Act that had been passed they thought, violated the 13th and 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And it was really a test case brought on by the NAACP. Well, he didn't win it in the state court, so he takes it to the Supreme Court, and he lost in the Supreme Court. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled against him, saying that the 14th Amendment was not put in place to enforce equality of two races before the law. I'm sorry, I misread that. The 14th Amendment was put in place to enforce the equality of the two races before the law, but it was not intended to abolish the distinction based on color or enforce social equality. So, separate but equal is constitutional. The color line had been drawn by the Supreme Court, and it's going to be in use until 1954 when we have Brown v. the Board of Education. Almost 60 years. Separate but equal. And folks, it was separate, but it was never equal. After this decision, the black men viewed almost as aliens whose ignorance and poverty and racial inferiority were not compatible with a logical and orderly process of government. In other words, if you didn't have enough intelligence, you couldn't vote. Have they done anything to warrant this? No. And the literacy rate had skyrocketed after the war, and they were black property owners, they were black business owners, they were even black artists. It's just a stupid thing to say, and I'm not even going to dignify that statement by Senator Vandernam of Mississippi by repeating it. It's totally shameful. I do agree with our author's statement that the color line sought to obliterate any semblance of equality. Very true. And the only reason for a black man to be in a white's only place was as a nurse or caregiver. So why were there so many problems? Well, part of its massive black population moving to cities. Atlanta, New Orleans grew tremendously. Now, most of the black population did live in the rural areas, but there was a large percentage living in town. And living in town, they couldn't find employment. Housing was never easy. And with all those codes restricting where they could live, it didn't take long before we had a congestion of unsanitary houses, which, surprise, surprise, led to poor health and a high mortality rate. Housing and work was not the end of it, though, because of the color line. And by the early 20th century, major cities had laws for separate seating and public transportation. Oh, there was lots of if things they tried to boycott, and it failed too. Okay, now I'm going to give you a little bit of American history. By the 1880s, the United States had caught up with and even surpassed most of the European countries in industrialization. We were late getting started because of the Civil War, but once we got going, we got going. Now, Americans are living from the Pacific to the Atlantic and from Canada to Mexico. So where are we supposed to go? Because our history has been, ever since we came from Jamestown, always more expanding. We've always moved further, you know. And with all this industrialization, we need customers for our products because we're producing more than our own people can even consume. And we're also going to need raw materials to produce more. So where do we go? We didn't want to become imperialists like the Europeans. Besides, you know, the Europeans had already divided up Africa between Great Britain and Germany, Belgium, and France. So where do we go? West? Ah, that beautiful country of China. But it is so far away. But halfway to China, there's those lovely little islands called the Hawaiian Islands. Now, we had sent missionaries there to Christianize those heathens. We'd sent businessmen over there to grow sugar. And the king of Hawaii, not being a strong man, he was very easy to manipulate. And it wasn't very long before the Americans were, in fact, running the islands. All of a sudden, the old king dies, we get a new queen. And she's very xenophobic. She thinks that Hawaiians shouldn't be running Hawaii. And she wants the Americans out. Well, the white planters revolt, calling the American Navy, and to make a long story short, it was a short fight. U.S. wins, of course. And then in 1898, we actually annexed it. I guess power makes right. Might makes right. Might makes right. That's the expression. And this has nothing to do with anything. It's just it doesn't even show all of it. It's like 1,500 miles of islands, and you've got some big islands and little islands. These are the main ones we hear about, but there's hundreds of other little islands along there. And it's got beautiful scenery, the ocean coming in with the greenery, and it's got volcanoes. I just thought it'd be nice just to run a picture. Now, your text tells you in one sentence that we acquired Samoa. But there's a really interesting and kind of funny story because Germany, the U.S., and Great Britain, all three wanted the exclusive use of this particular island. So each nation sent warships there. And we're just about to begin firing when all of a sudden there's a storm, a typhoon comes up, destroys most of the navies of all three nations that were there. And then they sat down and they said, you know, don't think God wants us to do this. So they decided to divide it up. Germany and U.S. divided up Samoa and gave England some of the islands we had, and Germany gave her some islands she had. So actually, England wound up with the more land mass than us. But one thing we wanted was there was a little port called Pago Pago. It's supposed to be one of the clearest ports in the world. So after we got everything settled, and oh, by the way, we didn't ask the natives. You know, why would they ask them? Which brings me to another thing. Expansionism and imperialism are similar, but they don't mean always the same thing. When you expand, or expansionism means moving on to adjacent land with plans for it to become a part of the United States. But imperialism, you're moving on to land that's already occupied, and you do it by force, military, finances, politics, and there's no plan for it to ever become part of the United States. You need these places to refuel, you need them for raw materials, and you need the people to buy stuff. But it's not just the islands out in the Pacific. We're also focusing on the Caribbean Sea. Now, there's one thing to remember when we start talking about these islands. These islands are populated with people who are not exactly, shall we say, white or Christian. And remember, we are a racist nation, and we have that color line here in our country. Now, your text goes into one island in particular in the Caribbean called Cuba. Now, Spain, once a very, very powerful European power, had never really recovered from the defeat by the British back when the British defeated the Spanish Armada back in the 1500s. But she still does retain control of islands, not only in the Caribbean, but also in the Far East called the Philippines. But the island of Cuba is only 90 miles off our coast. Now, the people of Cuba revolted against Spain several times over the year, and by the 1890s was at it again. Well, Spain decided enough was enough and sent a general called General Weyler to take control and take down the violence and the insurrection. He became known as the Butcher for his brutal means. He'd take prisoners and put them in concentration camp atmosphere, and stories began to circulate that they were strip searching women and killing men and boys. Was it true? We'll never know for sure. Probably not. Hertz and Pulitzer. I'm having trouble with my tongue today. I'm sorry. Hertz and Pulitzer, New York newspaper editors, they were in a circulation war. And they began printing stories that were based on rumors, not facts. And this is in the age of the camera, folks. When we were taking pictures during the Civil War, and this is happening 20 years later, we had cameras around, but the pictures in the papers were usually pen and ink drawings. So how true were they? But they were operating on the fact that if you didn't have any news, make it up. Well, there was so much news going on in the paper, like you can see from the little flyer, Free Cuba. Both papers began calling on the United States to help to kill Cubans. Now, this type of paper is called yellow journalism, but the people don't realize it, and now the public opinion is calling for the United States to free Cuban people from Spain. Yeah, when I was doing my graduate work, I worked for a newspaper, and I was the obituary clerk. And I don't laugh, I know my name's Graves, and I was the obituary clerk. I could not even accept one call from the funeral home. I had to have 2 verifications plus the funeral home that the person had actually died. We had to verify, and then verify again before we put anything in the paper. So I can't imagine just taking somebody's word for it. But the president we had at this time was President McKinley, and he didn't want to go to war. He'd been in the Civil War. He knew what war was like. No, war was not what he wanted to do. Spain wasn't interested in war, but the newspapers kept it up. And finally, he was forced by Congress he was pressured, basically, to go see what's going on. So he sends a ship down to Havana to see what's going on. And guess what? Everything blew up. 250 men and officers were killed, and about 30 plus African-American soldiers were killed, or sailors, not soldiers. So American blood has been spilled. And so now we declare war on Spain. Did Spain destroy the Maine? Did the Cuban rebels destroy? Well, if Spain had destroyed it, that would have been the stupidest thing they could have done, was to destroy it, and because they knew what would happen if they did. But did the Cuban rebels destroy it because they were trying to get us to come into the war? It didn't matter, and we didn't find out for decades what really happened, but Americans had been killed on a foreign shore. And when we did find out what actually happened, they were examining the boat on the bottom of the bay, and they discovered that the explosion had come from the inside out. It was an empty coal container that had combusted. So it was an accident, plain, pure, and simple, that we went to war, but we didn't know it at the time. President McKinley calls for 200,000 volunteers. And while most of the African Americans were willing to enlist, there were some that felt, well, Cuba's filled with blacks. And the American policy on blacks, well, why would I fight to enslave more blacks? But it was just a few that felt that way. Now, in 1898, we had a very small army, only 28,000 men. And most of those were either the blacks stationed in the West or officers stationed in the East on desk job. We had 4 African-American units. There were 2 cavalry and 2 infantry. They were experienced. They'd been stationed in the West to not offend any of the Southern dignities and to fight the Indians. And the Indians called them buffalo soldiers because their hair was short and curly like the mane of a buffalo, and they considered it a compliment. Now, these are just some pictures of some black soldiers, and here on the right, you see that's Teddy Roosevelt sitting down. He took with him 18 pairs of glasses and 3 uniforms that had been specially tailored when he got up his Rough Riders unit. But it was the black man that bore the brunt of the fighting. More than 5,000 Americans died, and they weren't from battle wounds, heat, prostration, and disease. And the blacks fought beautifully. They fought well. And they were well received and received accommodations after they had been seen fighting. But in the beginning, they got no respect and usually were viewed with suspicion, and even sometimes after they'd won a battle. And they actually saved FDR and the Roosevelts, FDR and the Rough Riders. They did protest their treatment because they were treated like dirt. They sent stories to the newspapers, but it didn't do any good. So what did our future president Theodore Roosevelt think about the blacks? He vacillated in his opinion. It depended on where he was and what he was asked. It also depended a lot on the information he'd been given. He accused one group of soldiers of deserting when they had been sent back from the front lines to get supplies. All he did was see them going in the other direction. He called them deserters. He didn't take time to find out what was going on. But the war's won, and now the United States controls the islands in the Caribbean and the far Pacific. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, for example. So guess what? Now we are an imperialist nation. And the people are just, well, they're a bit unsure how to handle the situation. Congress doesn't know what to do or how to govern them. And these islands have been ruled by the foreign Catholic nation for centuries. So should we turn the land back to the natives? Should we make them a protectorate? Should they, if we do this, will they send thousands of unskilled workers to the United States and bring down the wages? Well, you know they're not white and they're not Christian. Besides, with the Philippine Islands, they're so far away, but it's so close to China. It makes such a great refueling station, and all those people in the Philippines I know just would love to buy our products. So they left occupiers there, and the situation was, quote, stabilized. Many of them were black. Yeah, I'm sure that most of you have never heard of the Philippine War. Okay. Emilio, I don't know if I can say it or not, Aguinaldo, Aguinaldo. He's upper class, he's educated, and a bit of a snob. But he had helped us during the Spanish-American War fight against the Spanish. But now he wants to rule. After all, what he said made sense. He didn't want to trade one imperial power for another, Spain for the United States. So he became a leader of rebels against the United States. And we began to fight a very, very brutal guerrilla warfare in the jungle. Now, some of the black soldiers did deserve to join the rebels. So President McKinley sends William H. Taft over to govern and bring things under control. And he does an excellent job. He helped them formulate a new constitution. He taught the natives to govern and vote. He built schools and hospitals and roads and just poured millions of dollars into this island. And thousands of Americans died, and the war didn't end until the rebel leader was killed. And we took control, and we kept control until the middle of the 20th century. We're kind of like the old maid aunt that comes to dinner and never goes home. Now that is imperialism. And we had no intention of ever letting the islands become a part of the United States at all. No. But Puerto Rico and Cuba, pretty much the same problems, less the rebellion. Spain had ruled them. They were Catholic, they were not white, and they'd been under someone else's thumb for hundreds of years. Now this is just a picture of the island of Cuba. As you can see, just off our coast, it's easier, I guess, like this. Here's Florida, and here's Cuba. And this is just a picture of the black men who were stationed there to fight and to, after the which to restore the peace. It's perfect. It's beautiful. It's close to our borders. It's great for growing sugar. I mean, after all, that's the reason we got into war, was to help the Cuban people. So we let them become a protectorate. And we did improve things. We built new schools, new roads. We instituted a health system. We helped them write a new constitution. And their constitution had some rather unusual components. Something called the Platt Amendment was added, which allows the United States to intervene if Americans or American property is threatened. It does not allow Cuba to accrue any debt. And it grants us perpetual use of Guantanamo Bay, which we still have. Puerto Rico, this is a very bad map picture, but here again, here is Florida. Here is Cuba, and way over here, this is Puerto Rico. We made it a protectorate, and we set up the government to keep the black natives from having too much power, because you see, the people in Puerto Rico were a little bit darker complected than those in Cuba. After all, we didn't want the United States blacks to think that they could gain power. Well, sure enough, 15 years, 17 years after the war, we allowed the Cuban Puerto Ricans to become United States citizens, and they could vote. But no one could ever become a president, and the United States hold power to appoint all major officials. Also, that same year, we purchased the Dutch West Indies. Now it seems like we have control of the islands of the Caribbean, which is going to protect our Gulf shores. That sounds good. You got to take care of yourself. And every now and then our government does something that makes me really proud of her. She uses her noodle. And she began to send black men as ambassadors and representatives to the U.S. from the U.S. to the islands and countries that contained a majority of black citizens. And I thought, you're using your, even W.E.B. Du Bois was suggested to go one time. It's just, you know, when you go into an area that's undeveloped, and they were backwards in so many ways, they had not been allowed to come into the 20th century. And we have some highly educated, skilled black people. And sending them down there to talk, it just makes so much more sense. And then, of course, it mentions Haiti. Extremely poverty ridden. Because the upper class holds the power and the money, and they're not about to turn loose. And they still haven't recovered from that hurricane that went through there. It's just, Haiti just makes me want to cry. So the African Americans on the mainland of the United States began to realize, the black population of the world is now on the world stage. We've got black islands, we've got black countries in Africa. I mean, the blacks are out there. But the Americans and Europeans continue to operate under the mantra of the dark-skinned peoples of the world. They need to be Christianized and need to be taught to be more like the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. In other words, it is our Christian duty to help our little brown brothers. In 1865, the slaves had been freed. But by 1900, with the Black Codes and Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the stage had been set to the return of legal slavery in the South. White supremacy ruled. The color line had been drawn, and although the North had won the war, she really had lost the peace. Now, the last part of this chapter deals with the violence, especially after this war with Spain. And I'll open our lesson next time with that, chapter 13, which is called Self-Help. So we'll go from the violence that's being perpetrated against the black man into the fact that they're going to end up helping themselves.